Welcome to RHI's Sociable City Interviews, where we meet with global thought leaders on nightlife and the social economy. Today we are here with Stephen Parker, Executive Director of the National Independent Venue Association. Parker works with NIVA's board and staff to grow the association's membership, expand national partnerships that advance the live entertainment sector, and empower members with resources to strengthen the future of live entertainment. Before NIVA, Parker served in senior and advisory roles at the National Governors Association and the Country Music Association.
Hey, Stephen, it's great to see you today. I love your background. Boy, do you play all of those instruments?
Not at once, but I try to cycle through them every once in a while.
Well, that's cool. So you've been a musician and you played in live performances?
I grew up playing in church. I have played in a couple of bands, but not anymore. I like
Oh.
to make sure that there are stages for musicians to get on, but those stages are much too popular for me.
Well, you and I met in DC, and you gave me a little history of what I think is the most appropriate background for somebody in your position. Not just the background that you have now on Zoom, but just your personal experience. So just a snapshot of what are the things that you've done, um, the different life chapters you've had, because it seems like you've had many life chapters so far that kind of make you in this position the most effective person to take on this role.
Oh, I I'm happy to be here. I'm sure that listen, we have many people who lead our organization before I got here and now that I'm here that are incredibly effective, but it's an honor to have this role. I grew up in Southern Virginia, a place called Farmville, Virginia. Very low income, single parent household. My mom worked three jobs to make sure that we were able to have a roof over our head and something to eat. And a lot of times that was tough. And we didn't always have something to eat on our table. Um, I am fortunate that I got to go to college on the Pell Grant, but first community college and then to our university in my hometown. And my first job out of college was as a fellow for the governor of Virginia at the time, which was Tim Kaine. I was offered a job at the end of that summer, and stayed on and worked for him for almost 3 years. Was kept by the Republican governor who came after him. Spent some time in at the National Guard, trying to fight for more funding for National Guardsmen who were deploying pretty regularly to Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. And then I got a job that ultimately shaped me for the rest of my career and really prepared me for this role at NIVA, which is working for the National Governors Association. I was there for a decade. I started as what they called a scholar when I was in grad school, and then worked my way up to eventually leading their federal relations department, and working a lot with members across the spectrum. Where we were a bipartisan organization, they still are, and working on both sides of the aisle in a place that's rare in DC, where the Republicans and Democrats still go to the bar at the end of the day and get a drink together. That is increasingly changing. But in the building where all the governor's offices and state legislators and National Governors Association were, that happened until I left and still does happen until this day. So working together on both sides of the aisle was a huge part of what that instilled in me. And also it prepared me for this job because we are a bipartisan organization and we are just as much here and venues are just as much here, due to Republicans and Democrats working together as opposed to them working separately.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to frame it. But you also were involved, I think, with the country music
Yeah,
world.
so I took a sabbatical, as I say. I had some leave in 2019 that I needed to burn, and my organization, given that I didn't take very much vacation during my first 8 years at this organization, they said at National Governors Association, they said you need to take some leave. You shouldn't lose all this leave. And so my wife couldn't go on vacation at the time. She had just started a new job. And I didn't want to go to a beach and sit somewhere by myself. So I called my friends at the Country Music Association and asked if they would make me an intern. And they didn't understand. And I said, listen, give me a cubicle somewhere in your office and just give me random work for me to learn your industry and just have a really cool experience. And I spent a few months there and lived in Nashville. God bless my wife for letting me take this adventure, and it changed my life. CMA is an incredible organization. I was working a lot on the foundation side, which is their foundation is a music education, grant making, and policy organization that basically tries to advance music education across the spectrum, genre neutral. Doesn't matter whether it's music education in classical music or country music, just making sure that teachers in national organizations had funding and resources to fight for music education at the state and local level from a governmental perspective, and supplies, including instruments in schools across the country. And so, when I left CMA to come back to my job at NGA, my actual paying job, I had the bug, and
Yeah.
I kept in touch with them. And then the pandemic hit 2 months later after I got back, and helping them through the pandemic and helping their artists through the pandemic get connected to unemployment insurance and workforce development was huge for me. And honestly, those direct correlations at CMA during the pandemic are very much how I got tied into NEVA.
So NEVA really was a grassroots movement. I know that Gary Witt and Moose and Dana Frank were kind of the pinnacles, as far as I know the history of it, that really somehow got together and made things happen. And I know that coming from Minnesota, it helped to get Amy Klobuchar on board as a representative and getting Schumer from New York City. Those were two people that were instrumental in that. So what galvanized? I mean, this is an industry that typically is not one that organizes itself or gets organized. Besides just the mere fear of survival, what tone and what perspectives evolved from those early months of getting these different people together? I mean, I know you were involved with the Country Music Network, but you weren't involved with NEVA at first. So
No,
from your recollection and what you've learned from them, what were those, what did that network bring that wasn't there before?
I've worked in policy and advocacy. At the time when the pandemic started, I had been in it for 15 years. And, the day that NEVA formed, I remember it was late at night when I found out about it. They were formed earlier. They sent out a press release, and basically, I found Moose's number online and called him and asked him if I could be helpful. And he connected me to Dana, and Dana and I emailed back and forth. They didn't need me. The reason they didn't need me, even though I tried to be helpful where I could, was they had an incredible engaged membership who knew what they were doing, who are in the live entertainment business, and they knew how to translate what they were putting on stage every night before the pandemic into basically a very compelling argument to Congress and to the White House and to their states and their cities, where they were able to get aid as well. We had a board. Our first board was small. It was Dana Frank from First Avenue. It was Stephen Chilton from Arizona. It was Stephen Sternshine from Austin. It was Hal Rial, from which the idea for NEVA came before the pandemic, from World Cafe Live in Philadelphia. And together, along with Moose, they galvanized an entire industry. Dana is a visionary. She's one of the smartest people I've ever had the privilege to work for. And, every advocacy campaign needs a leader who helps the people who are fighting believe. And she did. And they believed. And
so she was the champion from your perspective.
She led our advocacy, and she was the leader we needed, and still is a leader that we need, and is still very engaged in our advocacy work, even to this day. And where I sit, I was at NGA. I was helping the music industry where I could, but my job was dealing with the unemployment crisis. It was dealing with school closures and the massive amount of education funding that was flowing. And then NGA was involved in a fiscal relief fund. And so we pushed billions of dollars in state and local funds out through the CARES Act, and then through subsequent acts all the way up to the American Rescue Plan. But the scope and magnitude of what NEVA was able to do when it comes to the largest arts investment in U.S. history, $16.25 billion, cannot be understated. That is a large number by any estimation, but it's an especially large number when you consider it was delivered to the arts community, which has been underinvested in by the US government and by state and local governments for generations. It's historic. And Dana, but the entire advocacy committee that was involved in this is responsible for this win.
You said you had $16 billion that was raised from
The Congress
Congress,
delivered
and you had this small cadre of people who ran independent music venues who all of a sudden had to figure out what to do with $16 billion. I mean, that's like winning the lottery and wondering what you're going to do with it. I mean, how do they mobilize to get the resources to figure out how to distribute all of those funds?
So one, I don't know if you remember this, Jim, but there was a big problem with implementation. When the Small Business Administration launched the portal, it crashed, and they had to take the application for the Shutter Venue Operator Grant, which is the name of the program that delivered that $16.25 billion to the live entertainment sector, offline. And it was offline for weeks. And basically, it was NEVA who went in with our friends from Aiken Gump, who were our very effective advocates during the Save Our Stages days, to try to work with the very new Biden administration to fix these technological issues so that venues could start to apply and receive these funds. And sure enough, it took longer than it should have, but they were able to do it. You know, the law that creates SVOG tells venues what they can use this on. And it primarily was for reopening activities, because if you recall, even by the summer of 2021, when venues started to receive those funds, many of them were still closed. I know in Washington, D.C., where I live, you know, the 930 Club was not open yet. It was not until that fall that we started to see shows reopen in a place like Washington, D.C. In California, I believe it was even later. Some rural southern states, obviously, that happened earlier, but reopening was a huge challenge. And many venues that even if they were regulatorily allowed to reopen, didn't have the resources to actually reopen until they got their SVOG funds, just because of the cost of hiring back employees, the cost of getting your venue back to where it should be and safely accept fans, because they had been closed for close to a year and a half. All this takes time and money that they didn't have. And so SVOG was a lifeline.
Yeah, well, I remember too, the challenge of getting the touring clubs to the touring acts to be able to schedule, because, you know, you had some cities that still had closures and others that were opening up. And so if you're a performer, you know this yourself, you have to map out your tour. You go from city to city to city to city. And I remember that some of the musicians were even cautious about performing for fear of COVID. A lot of that was before the vaccinations and other things that were going on. So I remember even when clubs could open, they weren't able to book the acts in the way that they were before.
Yes, I was not here for that, but I remember seeing it as a fan. But it was a challenging time. It was a challenging time even after venues reopened, and we'll get to this later in the conversation, but it still is a challenging time for a number of venues.
Yeah, no, I know that. We were just in Fort Worth, 2 music venues closed there. Yeah, this is an amazing story where you went from a small kind of, get together to this multi-billion-dollar campaign. And you now have an organization that's established with chapters throughout the country with dedicated individuals, some of whom, like Howie in New Orleans, have become what we call nighttime managers, really being kind of a central figure in liaison. And New Orleans just recently implemented something that we talked about back in 2006 and 7 when we worked in New Orleans, the fact that musicians don't have loading zones and they don't have safe places to park their vans when they have all their equipment, and a lot of equipment is stolen. So I think Howie has been instrumental in New Orleans because of his background in the music industry to advocate for, which now has become a part of the outcome, a loading stands. And some people don't think about music venues and making them successful as having loading zones. But every city we've worked in, when we talk to musician clubs, they said that's really one of the most important. If they could have anything, it would be loading zones for their musicians. You know.
Sure. Listen, it's such a musicians aren't asking for the world.
Mhm,
They're asking for something
mhm,
to know that cities care. You know, I went to a panel at Americana Fest in 2021. And the person who runs the Fort Worth music office, which at the time was only a few weeks old,
mhm,
stood up and said that they were offering small travel grants. I believe it was between 100 and $500. And this is for the musician's entire tour. And he said that musicians came to them and said, this may not last us the entire tour, but the fact that you're doing something means so much. Right before they unveiled the musician loading zones in New Orleans, I got to go and spend a couple of days with Howie because our conference next year is going to be in New Orleans, and I got this picture of Howie in the
mhm,
courtyard of the uh, of Preservation Hall, and you can't read it, but
mhm.
that's the sign that they were about to put up for musician loading zones, and
Well,
such
yeah.
huge Howie fans. He's one of us. He ran a venue and he went directly from a venue and became the night mayor of New Orleans. And we're so proud of him. And I'll just say, you know, just talking about the strength of the chapters, you know, we had a huge victory at the federal level. And we're going to continue to fight at the federal level. We are already. We still have significant resources dedicated to our federal work. But state and local, from a policy perspective, from an advocacy perspective, from a funding perspective, that is the music ecosystems, that is the venue ecosystem's future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's where we constantly are struggling when we work with cities to try to balance that. And I think there's a movement for more consumer demand for live music. But I think you have developers who are building high-rise condos and hotels that want tablecloth restaurants, and they don't want bars. They don't want late night. They basically don't want to have to deal with residents complaining about the sound, And so there's a lot of restrictions that are coming in place, and actually no foresight to recognize that there are ways to manage sound if you organize your policies better. But there's just this: we don't want bars, we don't want nightlife, we don't want loud music, and I think that's at the local level. I agree with you. That's where the greatest challenge is getting those forces to come together.
Well, Jim, you and I have talked about this. I think it starts not with the passage of law, not with some big new funding scheme. It starts with musicians and venue owners and venue
Mhm.
operators and artists having a seat at the table.
Mhm.
And, you know, I think when you think about a planning commission and the power that they have over this industry, one, I'm not saying that that system should change. Planning commissions play an important role in state and local, and particularly in local zoning.
Mhm.
But why not have more venue owners on there? Why aren't we pushing as an industry to make sure that there is a more inclusive conversation that makes sure that the artist voice, the venue voice are at the table? We
Yeah.
need more of that. That doesn't cost a local government any more money. All it is a broadening of their horizons as far as who they have at the table.
And this ties to the point that you made about Howie. He brought not only his own history within music, but also he has a place at the table in government. And I think Nashville too, Benton, I think
And
comes from
that's
that
and I,
background.
listen, I agree. Having a staff member in government is wonderful, but there are boards and commissions. I live in Alexandria, Virginia. We just had a pretty big announcement here about live entertainment yesterday that made national news. And, you know, we don't have any venue owners on boards and commissions here that
Hmm.
are making these decisions. Most cities don't. We
Hmm.
don't need venue owners and artists to run for office. We don't even need them to be salaried by the city. We just need them to get consideration for the boards and commissions that volunteers serve on every day to make sure that when these decisions are made by the residents who are moving things along at the local level, that they're there. And one, know that these opportunities are there to be on these commissions, and two, get fair consideration by the mayors, city councils, county boards that are appointing to these commissions.
And one of the recommendations we often make in order to make that happen is don't hold meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning if you want music venues to serve on your boards or your commissions.
It's a good one.
Which is what they always, and it's like, well, they don't care. They don't show up. It's like, yeah, well, what time did they close? 3, and they had to close up their club, man. You're asking them to show up at 8 in the morning, it's just not an easy thing to do. So it sounds to me like what you're saying is your chapter programs have really kind of helped at the local level begin to be advocates for having a seat at the table.
Absolutely.
They've done things like Howie did, which seems to most people as an insignificant accomplishment. But like I said, we were talking about loading zones in New Orleans, 15 years ago, and it takes.
And
a
it
long
shouldn't
time.
have taken that long.
I know. And then you have all of the things about this prohibition against late night music venues because you're building condos and you don't want the residents to be disturbed without necessarily looking at what is called agent of change, which is the developer's responsibility to make the soundproofing rather than not allowing the venues to open or closing them down if they exist. So what do you think of that direction?
Well, one, I think, just a comprehensive sound ordinance review. I mean, it is repressive for live entertainment to have some of these sound ordinances in place that are incredibly restrictive. Not just incredibly restrictive, impossible to adhere to in many cases. And as you know, Jim, many of those policies around sound are rooted in systemic discrimination that has existed across our country and in government for a long time. And we need to evaluate that carefully. And it has to be national in scope. I mean, we should do it city by city, but I mean, this is if you're seeing it in every city, this is a national problem. We need to treat it as such.
That's really another underlying factor of complaints about certain venues. It's the evolution of venues that bring in a kind of a Latin or Black cultural music. And then that attracts a crowd. And the established kind of policymakers don't want that crowd. So that's, I think, a conflict that needs some focus because country music venues can make the same amount of sound, create as many fights outside when people leave as a hip hop club does. And not to say that, or not to suggest that there aren't situations with some Black oriented clubs that don't bring in gangs, which is really part of that problem. But when you start to make judgments about a venue's safety based upon their music, if it's culturally related, there's a bias there, and I think that's something that also comes into play at the local level.
We're seeing that bias not just in how sound rules are made, we're seeing it in insurance. What difference does your genre make when you're applying for a commercial insurance application?
Well, that brings up.
Why do you have to put that down?
Yeah.
Why? I don't understand.
So. Well,
anyway.
we could talk forever on all of this stuff, but what do you think the future is for these music and performance venues? It's 18 months ago, there was the question of whether they would survive. Now some of them are coming out, catching up and doing as much as they can. But beyond the local policies, you also have the growing impact of Live Nation and those types of entities that take talent away from the independent venues and also just get the consumer money being spent differently. So there's a whole plate full of things. But what would you list the top 3 challenges that your association is working on and what people are working on locally?
So there's a lot in that question, Jim. So let me break it down a little bit. I am fortunate that I get to work almost every day with a board member, the vice president of NEVA, Audrey Fick-Schaefer, who's the communications director for IMP that operates the 930 Club. And she says something that I think is so true. And it reflects what I heard, what we would say at NGA all the time. When you've seen one state, you've seen one state.
Mhm.
She says that our industry is not a monolith. And I would apply my NGA argument by saying when you've seen one venue, or you've seen one promoter, you've seen one venue, or you've seen one promoter.
Mhm.
Everything is different. There are some independent venues, many independent venues who are doing extraordinarily well post-pandemic. And they are growing. They're able to open potentially new rooms or expand their current ones. Ticket sales are up. Bar sales in some cases are up. In many cases, it's going down. But we also are hearing, not anecdotally, pretty consistently from the broader community, particularly smaller venues, that are still struggling.
Mhm.
And, you know, we're alarmed. And from my perspective, it's NEVA's job. If we don't do this, we're not doing our jobs right. It's NEVA's job to make life easier for
Mhm.
every venue, but particularly those venues that are running into financial difficulties. You know, we're working on trying to use our collective buying power to see if we can get savings for venues. We're seeing some initial success in a pilot. We're hopeful to be able to work to broaden some savings programs for our members in the new year. But, you know, venues need two things. One, they need people to know that if they don't go there, they need
Mhm.
fans to know if they don't go there. They need artists to know if they don't go there, that those venues might not be there
Yeah.
the next time that they want to go out. And then second, we need the community and for government to understand that the capital market does not exist for live entertainment.
Mhm.
And we need more equitable treatment of venues, promoters, festivals across the spectrum when it comes to capital that they need to not only keep their doors open, but to scale so that they can continue to bring in revenue and put themselves in a more secure financial position. These are two core problems that are out there on top of inflation. There was a CNBC story that I encourage everybody to look up. Just search for NEVA CNBC. It is a long story that features several very prominent venues, including a couple of board members throughout the country, that talks about the impacts of inflation.
Mhm.
These are massive, broad macroeconomic issues that are running head on into an industry that had issues before the pandemic that have been exacerbated since the pandemic. And we have got to work on stopgap solutions as an association to make sure that they are going to be taken care of.
Yeah, yeah, these are all important. I know the UK inflation and people's disposable income is changing, so that's having an impact. But oh, this has been a fabulous conversation. I mean, we could go on forever about all of this stuff, and I know you'll be in Dallas moderating a panel, so I think we'll get some more insights just from the operators on that panel. But I want to thank you for this and you know wish you a lot of luck. Let me know if there's anything I could do to help in whatever limited way that we could. But it sounds to me like you've got what it takes in terms of passion and talent and creativity and not only you but the whole network of people that you work with. You know, innovation is really part of what the music culture is about. It's always finding something different or something that isn't there and really appealing to the changes in the market in a way that most other industries can't. So this has been a fabulous conversation and I wish you luck.
Jim, thank you. I'll just say really quickly before we go. One, our strength as an organization doesn't come from me or our staff. It comes from our incredible membership. And two, it comes from networks.
Mhm.
Networks like RHI that you all are creating and continue to grow every day. We need to be connected to each other, and we're grateful that you're making sure that we have a network that we can turn to when we need help the most. So thanks, Jim, for all you do.